What's up, people? I'm here with another video for our Thursday class, and we're continuing with our discussion of the antisocial thesis. And for this day's content, we're kind of keeping Heather Love's The Politics of Refusal on the table while also bringing in an excerpt of Queers Read This and AIDS Our Own Manifesto. And then we're also going to be viewing The Living End, Greg Araki's new queer cinema independent film. So I'm going to be laying out some connections between those texts for you. But first, I do want to run you through some reminders for class. Again, I generally leave reminders kind of at the beginning of every class. And hopefully, we won't need as many as we move forward with the semester as we get into the rhythm of remote connection and discussion. But just a few things here to kind of remind you about as we onboard a lot of these new components of the course. So first of all, I am asking you to join the class Slack workspace. I did send you an email about this yesterday, but if you haven't joined Slack yet, or if you are experiencing trouble joining Slack, please do or let me know, just so I can figure out the best way to get in contact with you. I am pushing notifications to Slack about work being put up on Blackboard. So if you're not in that space yet, I'd ask that you try to join as soon as possible or let me know if you can't. Secondarily, I am getting a lot of emails from people about deadlines. Yes, please. Deadlines for now are going to be very flexible. So if you're behind on the paper or your team facilitation, no big deal. Please just check in when you can. I know people are working to get their tech up and running and reestablish communication with one another. So deadlines are not going to be a problem. But because discussion entries are the spine of our course, I am asking you in your groups to please try to maintain the discussion entry schedule. It only comes around once every 4 weeks, so it really should only be a few groups of you who need to do this. But you really are providing the structure for everybody else, so please do make that your kind of top concern in terms of timing. I'll be putting up prompts just as usual, and hopefully, people will be able to put up some content for others to take a look and discuss. Um, our facilitation, reading, and mapping teams, please do check in with me if you're having trouble getting a hold of your teammates. We have some of these coming up every week, so I'm going to be grabbing them from you and sharing them with the class as they become available. Um, you will notice those slide decks popping up on Blackboard under the Reading and Mapping Theory Slides section that I've added to the class. And if you kind of navigate over there at the end of this video lecture, you will notice that we now have a project up on Loves the Politics of Refusal. So thank you so much for that team for submitting that work to us. I'm going to ask you all to review that project just to get a better grasp on Love's points here. And we'll kind of move forward in the semester with this kind of sharing of each team project. Okay, so that's all my updates for now. We are today continuing with our discussion of the antisocial thesis. We're really in this film using film to kind of explore theoretical concepts through cinematic world making. So the films I've selected to pair with major theoretical readings really are there to help you kind of think about how theory can articulate different kinds of worlds, to think about how theory can ask us to speculate or question what sort of worlds could exist. And I'm hoping that you're starting to see how the films kind of work in tandem with the theoretical constructs that we're exploring. So I'm going to walk you through a bit of connection between, we had a primary document, Queers Read This, we have Love from last class, and now we have this film, The Living End. What are some of the connections here and why are they important? Okay, so to begin with, some of you may have seen this document in other courses I've taught, Queers Read This. It is a manifesto that was handed out on the street anonymously, anonymously authored and distributed during the AIDS crisis, I believe dated to 1990. And it should have struck you as a pretty different sort of document from the others we've looked at in class so far. It is indeed one of the early places we go to look at how activists in the AIDS era were reclaiming the word queer. We see a really strong articulation of why the word queer um, speaks to people in this particular period of US history, and how these activists are seeking to reclaim the negative charge of that word and to use it to imagine a new kind of politics to address the crisis situation people were living through at the time. Now, remember, by 1990, the AIDS crisis had been ongoing for about a decade. So this is, not a new problem. It's something that queer people had been living with for many years by the time this document started getting circulated. You might kind of ask yourself how this text is different from other representations of queer politics that you might be more familiar with in the kind of last 20 years, as well as kind of how it's in conversation with that idea of counter identification we talked about. Um, one of the three styles of kind of identity formation that Munoz discusses in Disidentifications. We've been talking about identification, counter identification, and disidentification, and this text seems to be pretty clearly an articulation of counter identity. Um, kind of the building of a queer politics as a new form of kind of counter identificatory space. So you could ask, like, what are they identifying against in this piece? What are they rejecting? And how are they seeking to make space for something else? We could ask why this text might be valuable now. I mean, here we are living through a global pandemic and facing the fact that our country really is not set up to handle crises like this. There are systemic failures all around us. How is this text maybe helping us see connections between a prior moment of viral pandemic and the current moment? And then to bring in a concept from love, we might ask, how is this text backward? How does it seek to turn things around, particularly the word queer itself, to turn the energy in that word around and weaponize it against people who would have been using it negatively as a slur, right? How does this sort of reverse those relationships? We talked a bit about reverse discourse earlier in the semester, right? When we looked at Stryker. And here we see perhaps a similar kind of articulation of reversing a word that had been used to stigmatize. Um, so just two little areas of this text that we might pay attention to. Um, Very interestingly, right in here, we see how the people who put this manifesto together actually reverse some of the text or write it backwards. So we might ask, why are they doing that, right? What are they seeking to kind of indicate with that backwards typing there? Um, so this is from where the document tries to kind of introduce this new definition of queer. They write queer. Do we really have to use that word? It's trouble. Every gay person has his or her own take on it. For some, it means strange and eccentric and kind of mysterious. That's okay. We like that. But some gay girls and boys don't. They think they're more normal than strange. And for others, queer conjures up those awful memories of adolescent suffering. Queer. It's forcibly bittersweet and quaint at best, weakening and painful at worst. Couldn't we just use gay instead? It's a much brighter word, and isn't it synonymous with happy? When will you militants grow up and get over the novelty of being different? And then they reverse the text again, why queer? Well, yes, gay is great. It has its place. But when a lot of lesbians and gay men wake up in the morning, we feel angry and disgusted, not gay. So we've chosen to call ourselves queer, using queer as a way of reminding us how we are perceived by the rest of the world. It's a way of telling ourselves we don't have to be witty and charming people who keep our lives discreet and marginalized in the straight world. We use queer as gay men loving lesbians and lesbians loving being queer. And then they go on to write, they've taught us that good queers don't get mad. They've taught us so well that we not only hide our anger from them, we hide it from each other. We even hide it from ourselves. We hide it with substance abuse and suicide and overachieving in the hope of proving our worth. They bash us and stab us and shoot us and bomb us in ever increasing numbers, and still we freak out when angry queers carry banners or signs that say bash back. For the last decade, they let us die in droves, and we still thank President Bush for planting a fucking tree, Applaud him for likening persons with AIDS to car accident victims who refuse to wear seatbelts. Let yourself be angry. Let yourself be angry that the price of our visibility is the constant threat of violence, anti queer violence to which practically every segment of the society contributes. Let yourself feel angry that there is no place in this country where we are safe, no place where we are not targeted for hatred and attack. The self hatred, the suicide of the closet. Um, so they're talking about a lot of sources of violence. They're talking about external violence coming from the society, right? But they're also talking in this document a lot about internalized homophobia. This document isn't actually written primarily to straight people. It's written to other queer people as a call to kind of recognize and get angry about the sort of intoxication of queer people by homophobia ourselves, right? That we've learned to self-police in a way where straight people don't even have to oppress us anymore. We're doing it for ourselves. So this was a wake up call to a new kind of AIDS activism that needed to be much more direct than it had been in the past. Now, how does this connect to something like this film? First of all, for those watching along, I wanted to quickly play the trailer for this film, and you can rent this film on YouTube for about $3.
Which would you rather die for? Sex or love?
So what's your name? The sexy slab of buff beefcake.
Luke.
Stop it, Daisy. You just want to play hide the weenie with him, and you know it.
Where's the party, animal?
15 left. The test only verifies that you have the antibodies to the virus. Sorry.
I mean, you were careful, right?
Yeah, most of the time.
Prepare to swallow your teeth.
Guess again, Three Stooges. 48 hours ago, I was just another bummed out HIV positive homo minding my own business.
Go, dude! Go!
I'm a fugitive facing an accessory murder rap.
Dude, come on. It's gonna be rad.
You totally lost your mind. Where are you?
I don't know. Siberia?
Want to know what it is I like best about guys' bodies?
I really hate guys who talk during sex. Did I ever mention that?
I'm not going to fondle your crotch right now.
Why not?
Because I'm a responsible driver.
What do you say we go to Washington? Blow Bush's brains out. Or better yet, inject him with a syringe full of our blood? How much you want to bet they'd have the magic cure by tomorrow?
Many people live perfectly healthy, normal lives for years and years.
The world is ours.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so just a little window into how this film was marketed by its trailer. It's clearly an outlaw film about sort of normal gay guy who seroconverts, and then this other guy, Luke, shows up and kind of changes his life. So, who is Greg Araki? He is an independent film director. He's made at least 10 feature films, including The Doom Generation, Nowhere, and Mysterious Skin. And a lot of his films are really concerned with kind of gay disaffection and kind of alien encounters with otherworldly people or creatures. I would actually suggest, if you like The Living End, checking out his other films while we're all kind of stuck in our houses. This film was made for only $20,000 and was nominated for a Grand Jury Prize at Sundance in 1992. It does contain references to other films, particularly to Godzilla, as well as Andy Warhol's, both his art and his short films, as well as Derek Jarman, who's a gay British director, as well as the French New Wave films. And it is in dialogue with the style of AIDS activist collectives like ACT UP and the sort of like art pop wing of ACT UP, the affinity group Grand Fury, which was responsible for a lot of the design elements of ACT UP's work, including the Silence Equals Death triangle, the title cards and things, and the design of a lot of the printed matter in this film reference Grand Fury's work. Araki has to say about the film, quote, "At least for me, The Living End is a very kind of cathartic experience. The whole AIDS crisis has led to a certain attitude among gay people of acting now as opposed to being content. That has been the major benefit of AIDS. There is a real sense of urgency. And then he also says, quote, because homophobia is so prevalent, it becomes ingrained in your personality on all levels. It really informs my films, not just the presence of gay characters and gay themes, but in terms of being, as a director, the outsider. So we can see in The Living End a lot of questions getting asked about uh, gay men's responsibility, like what kinds of roles queer people should be playing during the AIDS crisis. Like, do gay people owe it to society to kind of solve the problem or take responsibility? Here we see Luke writing, I blame society, right? So clearly he doesn't feel responsible for the virus. Um, we could say the film is an artistic response to a lot of things happening in the early 90s, such as the representational politics of AIDS in that period in mainstream American media, the way in which gay men were blamed and made responsible for the AIDS crisis, and had to behave themselves and change the way they lived and had sex in order to make other people feel safe, right? And also the way in which the victims of the AIDS crisis, the sort of public figures, HIV positive public figures, were all people who had got it innocently, right? So not through sexual behavior, but through blood transfusions or through hemophilia, things like this. So we don't see a lot of representations of actually of gay men with AIDS in U.S. cinema. In fact, there are only, I believe I said in the podcast, only kind of two major films about the AIDS crisis in U.S. culture that have kind of gotten wide distribution. Um, the really famous one, of course, is Philadelphia, which is a super sentimental movie in which all gay men can do is kind of suffer and die, right? And these men are not passive victims in The Living End. They're very active, really responding. Um, we could also say that the film is responding to the normative politics of gay pride and respectability politics, which were proving themselves to be insufficient to responding to this crisis. A much more kind of angry militant politics was necessary. And so we kind of see this style in the film of outlaw culture, and a real desire to escape the conditions of the crisis rather than take responsibility for them. Um, Also, and we're going to talk more about this when we get to the queer art of failure, but the film is questioning these dominant understandings of social obligation, like what HIV positive people owed to other people, as well as capitalism. I really love the sequence where they just decide to like max out their credit cards because they're gonna die, and they just buy all this like ridiculous stuff. um, we could say also how maturity is socially constructed as something that often queer people are not ever seen as really hitting adulthood because we don't have sometimes traditional families or children. So these guys are just living in like a protracted adolescence. And then also dominant understandings of healthy choices. Eating cereal and beer for breakfast isn't necessarily the kind of healthy choice you're supposed to make when you're HIV positive. So how is Iraqi kind of flouting and kind of ironizing or satirizing those expectations? Um, he also cites anti-capitalist punk aesthetics as a major influence in his work. Um, Describing The Living End, he wrote, "It's just this really crazy punk rock explosion of raw feeling and experience with very little regard for the marketplace, whatever's commercial or acceptable or whatever." And we can really hear that sensibility in the soundtrack to this film, which has a lot of kind of grindcore and thrash music, very kind of non-pop uh, soundtrack. We could also pay close attention to details in the film. The way that Iraqi kind of designs the sets and to include small messages like this little tiny uh, graffiti of the word pride behind Luke in a key scene, all the choose death bumper sticker rather than the choose life anti-abortion politics of the 1990s. Um, I managed the protracted adolescence that gay men are kind of thought to be living in, where they weren't settling down and just having monogamous sex, and so that caused the AIDS crisis, right? That assumption, and so we see Luke and John eating Barbie cereal, which I think is really funny. And then, of course, in John's apartment, we see a lot of references to the French New Wave, as well as we see this blow up Godzilla, right? And Godzilla was infamously created as a mutant by kind of radioactive poisoning, right? So this kind of monstrosity is being pointed to in the movie as well. Some questions for you as you were watching. I was wondering what you were experiencing. Right? How might this film help us question the value of positive images of queer life? Love is really critical of this need to always have positive representation. What does it leave out? What does it prevent us from confronting or considering about queer life? And this film is not interested in giving us positive images. Um, of sort of responsible, concerned, healthy responses to the AIDS crisis. So, what does it mean to give these kind of more backwards or negative kinds of representations? There's also the title of the film is kind of a curious paradoxical formation. What is a living end, right? What is Iraqi pointing at with that idea? Um, Life and death are supposed to be binary opposites. So, what does it mean to call something a living end? And where do we see kind of that paradox operating in the film? Uh, Araki also titles this film The Living End, an Irresponsible Movie by Greg Araki. And I'm just wondering what you think the value of irresponsible queer media or representations are. I have a little video of him speaking a little bit about that title.
Well, the whole thing of the irresponsible movie actually came from a critical essay that I read when I was in film school by the film theorist Robin Wood. And it was actually about the film Bringing Up Baby, this Howard Hawks movie from the 30s. And it was about, that movie was essentially, it's a screwball comedy with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, but the structure of it is kind of the same as The Living End, in that it was about this kind of free-spirited, wild character that comes in and frees this kind of repressed, more sort of normal life character. And so The Living End sort of fit that paradigm, and it was related to that, and also just related. The whole film has a very sort of irreverent and kind of anarchic point of view. So it definitely it still applies. I think it was really great to see it again on the big screen with an audience and everything. I was so thrilled, to screen here, because it was really, the film's a really it's like a time capsule of that period, and it was very kind of raw and provocative and challenging, and it really pushed people's buttons. There were people that it was so controversial and kind of divisive when it came out. There were people that loved it and people that just hated it, and people were telling me stories about fist fights breaking out in bars over it, and just people getting so passionate and crazy about it, which to me as a filmmaker, was really sort of exciting. When we started making...
So you can hear here how Araki is very aware that he made a film that was going to set people off. So we could think about why would he do that, right? And the very knowing way in which he titles the film Irresponsible in a period when gay men were being asked to be super responsible for their bodies as vectors of disease. I'm wondering whether, we're all kind of in that position right now, right? So perhaps we could sympathize a bit with all the pressure and the way in which we're all having to kind of shelter in place right now. And because the government's inaction has made it so that we have to take responsibility, right? So how is The Living End in some ways a fantasy of not having had to do that and being allowed to have different and perhaps more honest responses to what in the 90s would have probably been a death sentence? Also, there's the film's allegorical structure, which I kind of asked you to think about in my last video, right? Like, what is Luke? Who is he? What does he represent in John's life? And we could say that Luke kind of is HIV, right? He shows up the minute John is diagnosed, and then he can never leave John. And he starts kind of giving John all these ideas about, breaking the rules, breaking the law, doing whatever he wants, right? We talked about negative freedom, and how it's freedom from rather than, rather than freedom to. And here we see a kind of Araki kind of speculating about, well, what if HIV actually is like super freeing? Because once you know you only have a certain amount of time to live, you kind of don't care anymore about things like making money or making other people happy, right? So, in a weird way, uh, this diagnosis becomes one of the most meaningful and most freeing things in John that's ever happened to John, and that's a kind of interesting concept that we might think more about. And then, how does the film open up new spaces to think about a lot of the types of feelings that more dominant mainstream representations of HIV would not have given any room to, like refusal, evasion, despair, disobedience, grievance, right? These more negative kinds of feelings that Luke starts shooting people who gay bash him, right? Like I think all of us have kind of wanted to do that at one point or another, but what would it mean to actually kind of make art that talks about that desire? Um, and so all of this is on the table as you watch and think about the film. And what I'm going to have you do is navigate back to the discussion entry board, and I'll post this image there too. And I'm going to put up a prompt for you. I'd like you to think a bit about the way the film ends and this final image, that we're left with John and Luke stranded on the beach together, kind of in the middle of nowhere. I'd like you to think about this image and a lot of the other things that I've raised in this video in relation back to love's concept of backwardness. So I will leave it there, and I'll be looking for your responses over on Blackboard. Be well.